Hello. Thank you for joining us today for the first in a series of 4 webinars on dyslexia and other language-based reading disabilities. This webinar, titled Dyslexia and Other Reading Disabilities, an overview of screening, assessment, intervention, and assistive technology, is a 2-hour overview that is designed to satisfy the professional development requirement established by the New Jersey Legislature. This first section will provide a general overview of dyslexia and a case study.
Hello, I'm Dr. Mary Farrell. I'm the Director of the Center for Dyslexia Studies at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Today I'll be talking about the definition of dyslexia as well as describing frequent characteristics of children with dyslexia. And I will be presenting a case history of a student with dyslexia. Meet Tim. He is a grade 2 student with dyslexia. This is a picture of Tim, a child who's been diagnosed with dyslexia. We are going to be talking about Tim today to help us understand dyslexia. When we meet Tim, he is in 2nd grade. What does dyslexia look like in a child's reading performance? So what does it look like when Tim is learning to read? We see that Tim has consistent difficulty in learning the associations between letters and letter sounds for both reading and for spelling. This results in substantial and persistent delay in acquiring reading and spelling skills. Tim makes far more mistakes in reading than his chronological age peers, both in reading lists of words or reading connected text. He makes more mistakes in spelling as well. So we see inaccurate word identification and inaccurate word spelling. We see inaccurate word identification in lists of words or in reading text. Tim has no difficulty understanding grade level texts that are read to him, but he often fails to understand the meaning of text that he reads independently. We call this a secondary problem in reading comprehension because his primary problem in decoding is taking up all of his attention on sounding out the words rather than permitting him to understand the meaning of what he's reading. So what does dyslexia sound like? What does it sound like when Tim reads? Tim reads more slowly than his chronological age peers. As he reads, he makes frequent errors of substitution, omission, or self-correction on words or parts of words. As he reads grade-level text aloud, he sometimes stumbles through words, reworking certain letters until the word matches a word in his oral vocabulary or trying to match a word in his oral vocabulary. It doesn't always happen. Or sometimes he may realize a word is wrong after he's already read it and he goes ahead in the text. He goes back to self-correct the word as he has used the context to judge that he has read the word incorrectly. In this case, he's using his oral language skills to correct for his poor decoding skills. Here's the neural signature of dyslexia. We've come to recognize this signature in the last 10 years. On the left, we see the pattern of how the average reader's brain is activated during reading. On the right, we see the pattern of activation for children with dyslexia. These patterns have been shown in studies through the use of fMRI technology. We can expect that Tim's brain probably reflects the neural signature of a dyslexia shown in this slide. Here's what dyslexia doesn't look like. We know that none of these popular myths are true about Tim or other students with dyslexia. Tim doesn't have difficulty with vision or hearing, although he might, but it's not part of dyslexia. Tim happens to see and hear just fine. Although Tim sometimes reverses letters and numbers, so do many other children in grade 2. In fact, we may see these reversals in many children through grade 3. Tim has never been observed to be seeing things backwards. Tim's difficulty with reading is not attributable to limited intelligence, low motivation, or limited effort. He has at least average intelligence, he wants to do well, and he is willing to work hard. And his good intelligence, motivation, and effort are reflected in the fact that he does fine with all studies except reading, spelling, and things related to reading and spelling. Dyslexia is certainly not due to poor teaching. Teachers who teach children with dyslexia are not the reason for their difficulty in reading. Dyslexia is not a rare disorder. Estimates range anywhere from 1 in 20 to 1 in 10 to as many as 1 in 5 children having this difficulty. Finally, dyslexia is not a disorder that Tim will outgrow. It will manifest itself in different ways throughout his school years, and depending on his occupation, it will last throughout his life. However, the prognosis is good because we understand enough about dyslexia, and we know how to support dyslexia, we know how to accommodate dyslexia, and we know a lot about assistive technology. With all of that, and an individual's willingness to work hard, individuals with dyslexia can be extremely successful. There are different models currently being used to diagnose dyslexia. Tim's profile is consistent with all 3 models. The oldest, best-known model, and probably most controversial model, is the Ability Achievement Discrepancy model. Although it doesn't work to identify all students with dyslexia, it does work for Tim. He has average ability as reflected in his IQ, and yet is working below average in reading and spelling. Another model to use is the RTI, or Response to Intervention model. Tim participates in small group instruction provided by his classroom teacher. She reviews phonics rules, previews vocabulary words and reading material, and provides a shorter list of words for Tim and the other students in his small group to memorize for the weekly spelling quiz. This helps many of the children in the group improve substantially, but it has not been enough for Tim. Tim is then referred for formal evaluation and possible classification. This will depend on his district and their policies. In a third approach, some people will identify dyslexia by looking for patterns of strengths and weaknesses in a child. Tim has definite patterns of strengths and weaknesses. He does well in math and appears to enjoy it. He does not do well in reading and spelling, and certainly does not enjoy those subjects. This is the official definition of dyslexia given by the International Dyslexia Association. So dyslexia is a specific type of learning disability characterized by difficulty in reading. It has been shown to be neurobiological in origin. Dyslexia is characterized by inaccurate and/or non-fluent word recognition. Dyslexia is manifested in difficulties in spelling and decoding abilities. These are unexpected difficulties because children with dyslexia have average or even above average IQs, and they do well in subjects other than reading and reading-related areas. The problem in most cases is caused by difficulty in phonological processing. Simply stated, these children have difficulty processing speech sounds, segmenting them, storing them accurately, retrieving them accurately, and in some cases, articulating them accurately. Children with dyslexia often suffer secondary consequences as a result of their difficulty in decoding. They may appear to have comprehension problems. These are due to the decoding problems. They may appear to have behavioral problems as they deal with their frustration with having difficulty learning to read. Let's talk about some characteristics of children with dyslexia. Some, but not all, children with dyslexia will show early signs of difficulty with the sounds of language. They will be late to talk, slow to learn new words in general, and have difficulty producing speech sounds. For some, but not all children with dyslexia, problems with speech may have been detected in preschool years. They may come to kindergarten having had a couple of years of speech therapy. Poor phonemic awareness is the core problem underlying their difficulty in learning to speak and in learning to read. They simply have difficulty learning to discriminate, record into memory, and retrieve the sounds of spoken language. Of course, the quintessential problem for children with dyslexia is that they have difficulty learning and mastering the association between letters and their sounds. They need far more practice than their non-dyslexic peers to achieve mastery of the association between a letter and its sound or sounds, particularly when it comes to vowels. As a consequence of not having mastered the letter and sound association, they have difficulty sounding out and learning unfamiliar words for reading. Typically, spelling is even harder than reading for children with dyslexia. Students with dyslexia generally have difficulty reading and spelling sight words. There are a variety of ways to define sight words. For today, let's include two kinds of words in sight words. One category would be words that are phonetically irregular, and there are many of these in primary literature. For example, the words what and who. A word like when, on the other hand, is an example of a word that is phonetically regular, but it has a component, such as the digraph WH, that the child may not yet have learned. So for all intents and purposes, if that child hasn't yet learned the digraph WH, the word when will be a sight word for him. It almost goes without saying that children with dyslexia need lots of practice and multisensory reinforcement on their sight words. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that all of these characteristic problems of students with dyslexia, poor phonemic awareness, difficulty learning letter sounds, and learning how to unlock unfamiliar words, spelling, all require lots of practice to mastery and need the use of multisensory instruction for gaining proficiency. Continuing on with characteristics of students with dyslexia, we have inaccurate and slow oral reading at the top. Another classic symptom of dyslexia is a student doing better on listening comprehension than reading comprehension. As we said before, the student does better on listening comprehension than reading comprehension because decoding problems impact reading comprehension when the student has to read on his own. We call this the decoding bottleneck. Many of us like to think of the student's level of listening comprehension as identifying the student's true potential for literacy. By the way, this is where accommodations such as the use of assistive technology come in. Having access to text through assistive technology permits students to manage grade level text across the curriculum. Going on to the next characteristic. Many times, students with dyslexia have poor handwriting. As dyslexia is neurologically based, it is not surprising that some, but not all, students with dyslexia also have poor handwriting. Once again, it takes practice to overcome this difficulty. At the same time, if a student is exposed early to keyboarding, he will have a choice of assistive technology options as accommodations for compensating for poor handwriting. Regarding written expression, many students with dyslexia will struggle with this as well. Actually, this is often due to their difficulty with spelling words. Let's call this the spelling bottleneck. They are very limited in what they're willing to write because they're limited to what they can spell. So you're going to see a marked difference between the answers that they can give you orally and the responses that they can put in writing. Again, assistive technology is there to help compensate for this difficulty. Last but certainly not least, we have to take into account the fact that once reading and writing present a struggle for students with dyslexia, many of them will avoid reading and writing. So the struggle becomes a vicious cycle. The student can develop some very bad habits, such as an over-reliance on context and guessing at words. Now let's take a look at some of the problems that can cause dyslexia. Difficulties may be found in some, but probably not all of the cognitive correlates that need to be working well for reading to be working well. A child with dyslexia might have difficulties in phonological processing, orthographic processing, rapid automatized naming, processing speed, working memory, or attention and executive function. We'll take a quick look at each of these in the next series of slides, and they'll be covered in much greater depth in the next section of the webinar. Okay, so we start with phonological processing problems because that's actually where it all begins. We've already talked about difficulties in phonological processing and how this may be reflected in delayed speech, early articulation errors, and poor discrimination of similar sounds, such as the sounds of v and p, the sounds of and v. Poor phonological processing issues persist for students with dyslexia even after they have begun to improve in reading. For example, I asked a third grader to tell me the names of the consonants. He said H, T, W. Obviously, he was confusing consonants with consonants. Some of the key problems that we see in children with poor phonemic awareness: difficulty with rhyming, difficulty with segmenting sounds, difficulty with segmenting words into sounds, difficulty identifying initial, medial, and final sounds. And you'll hear more about this in the next section. Children with dyslexia may have orthographic processing problems. Let me start with the definition of orthography. Orthography is the writing system of a language that includes letters, words, numbers, and punctuation marks. Some children have a deficit in this orthographic processing. That means that they have difficulty using letter and word patterns to aid in pronunciation. Here are some of the ways that might be reflected. Reversals used to be the hallmark for dyslexia, and it certainly is no longer a hallmark. We can expect to see letter reversals, as we said before, in average readers through third grade. However, in students with dyslexia, they may persist even longer, not because they have a visual perceptual deficit that results in them reversing letters, but they are developmentally behind their chronological age peers. So when they get to third grade level in reading, hopefully their letter reversals will stop as well. Because of the difficulty with spelling and spelling patterns, children with dyslexia have a tedious task when copying, either close by or from the board. While the average reader will copy in familiar chunks, for example, the average reader will have learned that you spell the sound ch at the end of certain words with the pattern TCH. The student with dyslexia has not learned that pattern, and they will have to copy the whole word and that intricate pattern letter by letter. And as sequencing can be a problem as well, even careful copying can be wrong as well as tedious. There's difficulty learning how to form new letters because the student is likely to be delayed in having a mental model of the letters, which can guide his writing. The student will have trouble remembering sight words. Just as the phonological deficit cause confusion with similar sounding letters, so the orthographic deficit causes confusion in identifying similar looking letters and words. Finally, there is no one better than a student with dyslexia for violating the rules of English spelling. How about starting the word kick with a CK? I've seen it. And ending it with a C. Two rules violated here. No English words begin with a CK. They come only at the end of words when they directly follow a short vowel. And few English words end with a C. A child with dyslexia will often have problems in rapid naming. Since this will be discussed at greater length in a later section, I'm just going to touch upon this briefly. Problem in rapid naming will show up in a difficulty sustaining attention to the process of naming or sounding symbols, a difficulty retrieving verbal labels rapidly, and a difficulty articulating words rapidly. Children with dyslexia often have processing speed problems. They will certainly show up in a slow and inefficient scanning of print, but they will generally have, or often have, overall slow processing speed. It's certainly going to show up in reading and spelling and writing, but it can also show up in retrieving math facts, even though they know they're math facts. So overall slow processing speed is something that often goes with the territory. Children with dyslexia often have problems in working memory. Working memory is the ability to hold information in memory and process it at the same time, and is weak in many students with dyslexia. For example, students with dyslexia have difficulty sounding out a word and constructing meaning of the text they are reading at the same time. They may have difficulty holding an oral direction, even a short one in mind, and beginning to follow the direction at the same time. These working memory problems are even harder for students with attention and executive function problems. We know that attention problems and executive function problems are often linked, and we know from research that there is great comorbidity with attention problems, executive function problems, and reading disability. Research tells us that between 25 and 40% of students with attention problems have reading problems. 15 to 35% of individuals with reading disability also meet criteria for ADHD. Okay, time to get back to Tim. Let's look at some other things about Tim's background. Let's look at family history. We know there is a hereditary factor in dyslexia, and sure enough, Tim's dad had difficulty learning to read. Look at Tim's medical history. Tim had frequent ear infections from an early age and continues to have them in grade 2. A history of frequent ear infections is a factor that frequently pops up in the history of students with dyslexia. Looking at Tim's preschool history, we see that Tim had speech and language services in preschool years for his delayed speech and articulation errors. Looking at school history, K1. When he got to kindergarten, Tim had difficulty learning letter names and sounds for reading and spelling. He had difficulty blending sounds into words. He had difficulty rhyming and identifying initial sounds of words. He didn't have any difficulty with math. At this point, in continuing to grade 2, he is still motivated to learn to read. That's why screening is so important, because if we can identify students with dyslexia early on, we can get to work on improving their reading skills before they lose their motivation. Let's look at Tim's current profile in grade 2. You'll notice that it follows the characteristics of a student with dyslexia fairly closely. He continues to make articulation errors. For example, there's the classic aminal instead of animal. And I already told you about continents versus consonants. Tim is frequently inaccurate in word recognition of both phonetically regular words and sight words. He reads more slowly than his classmates. Tim often guesses at multisyllabic words. Tim makes